Today, we will travel back in time to the depths of history to witness the birth of one of the greatest cities in the world, Rome. We'll dive into the myths and try to separate fiction from reality. Who were Romulus and Remus really? Did they actually exist? What was life like in the places where the mighty Rome would later rise? What peoples inhabited this land, and why did it become the birthplace of a powerful empire? Just think, a few hills, humble settlements, shepherds and hunters, and then a mighty empire, conquering vast territories, leaving behind a legacy without which the modern world would be unrecognizable. How did this happen? How did a tiny settlement on the banks of the Tiber grow into a city that changed the course of history? You've probably heard the myth of Romulus and Remus, the she-wolf, and the fateful battle between the brothers. But let's take a different look at this story. What if there's more behind these ancient legends? What if the true story of Rome is full of unexpected twists, dramatic events, struggles for survival, and the first steps toward greatness? Now think about it. How much has Rome given us? It was here that the principles of law were born, principles still used worldwide. It was the Roman roads that became symbols of progress, and their architecture still inspires modern architects. Latin, philosophy, military strategies, forms of government. All of these have their roots in Rome. But this future is still far off. Ahead of us is a journey spanning several centuries. We'll trace it from the very foundation of the city to the end of the Republic, witnessing Rome growing stronger, expanding its borders, facing internal crises, and finally reaching the moment when power falls into the hands of one man, Julius Caesar. Are you ready for this grand journey? Then, let's go. Intrigues, battles, great reforms, and truly fateful moments await us. Just think, how did a simple settlement on hills evolve into a city that became a symbol of greatness and power for centuries? The history of Rome's founding is full of myths and mysteries, and telling it is always captivating. The legend that everyone knows tells of Romulus and Remus, two brothers, sons of the god Mars and the goddess Rhea Silvia. But, as is often the case with myths, here truth and fiction intertwine. According to ancient stories, their mother, Rhea Silvia, was forced to become a priestess, and her children, threatening the local king's throne, were cast into the Tiber River. And then a miracle. The river didn't drown them, but instead saved them. A she-wolf, symbolizing maternal care and strength, nurtures and raises them. And years later, by the law of destiny, the brothers returned to the hill where they were found and established a city that would become great. But is this true? Let's take a look at the reality. Historians believe the first settlements in the area of what would become Rome appeared around 753 BC. These settlements were located on 7 hills, which were well protected from enemies due to natural obstacles. And, importantly, this area had a strategically important river, the Tiber. These factors formed the foundation for the creation of Rome. Rome started as a small settlement, just a few huts on rocky hills with limited room for expansion. But it was in this place that crucial trade routes intersected and various tribes, peoples, and cultures met. At a time when other cities, like Veii and Tarquinii, also competed for power, Rome gradually grew stronger. It became increasingly attractive to new settlers, offering advantages for trade and military strategies. Historically, the founding of Rome was tied not only to the myths of Romulus and Remus, but also to real political and social processes. The city was organized on a tribal system where people were divided into groups and gathered around leaders, most likely originally rulers or tribe chiefs. Gradually, these groups began to unite for defense against external threats and for collective efforts. Key factors in Rome's rise were elements such as the natural fortification of the hills, its advantageous location by the Tiber River, and, of course, its people, decisive, passionate, and ambitious. It was these people who made Rome a city that would not just survive, but expand and grow ever more powerful. And this is just the beginning of an incredible journey. So, from both a historical and mythological perspective, the birth of Rome is not just a mystery, but a story of how a small group of people with determination and resourcefulness laid the foundations for an empire that would change the world. And so, after Rome was founded, a period began that we often call the Regal Era. The moment still holds a mysterious atmosphere, from the legends of the brothers to the city's first steps. At first, Rome was a very small settlement, and its rule in the early years was concentrated in the hands of kings. After all, like in many early societies, kingship was the foundation of the political structure, and the chosen leader often became a symbol of unity and strength. But who were these first kings of Rome, and how did they guide the city through its formative period? Romulus, the one we mentioned earlier, became the first king of Rome. According to legend, he not only founded the city, but also established the royal dynasty, a kingdom that lasted for 7 centuries. Romulus was the first to rule as king, and during his reign, he not only strengthened Rome, but also created its army, established laws, and even organized the first Roman citizens. He laid the foundation for the future power Rome would have when it became a vast empire. Romulus established key elements, from political organization to military discipline. Of course, Romulus wasn't the only ruler, and if all the kings had been as remarkable, Rome might have become great much sooner. Let's talk about other kings. After Romulus came the reign of Numa Pompilius, who became known for his wisdom and peaceful nature. He focused not on conquests, but on the city's internal structure, establishing religious ceremonies and setting traditions in place. Numa was more of a legislator than a military leader, and many Roman traditions like priesthoods and religious rituals became foundational to Roman culture because of him. But not all reigns in Rome were peaceful. The next king, Tullus Hostilius, was a warrior, and his reign was marked by conquests. Rome began to expand beyond its hills. He fought neighboring tribes, especially the Alba Longa people, and faced threats both from outside and within. All of this required the king to be decisive, and Hostilius proved himself to be a ruthless but successful ruler. It was during his reign that Rome became a truly strong state. Then came King Ancus Marcius, who was also a military leader. But at the same time, he promoted peaceful development. He expanded Rome's territory and strengthened its relations with neighboring tribes. His reign was marked by improvements in infrastructure, the building of coastal fortifications, and territorial expansion. However, the most important milestone in Rome's royal history came with the reign of Tarquinius Priscus, the last king of Rome. He did immense work to improve the city, building temples, expanding forums, and strengthening city walls. But despite his successes, Tarquinius Priscus's rule marked the beginning of the end of the royal era in Rome. His cruelty, harsh governing methods, and attempts to concentrate all power in his hands led to the people finally rebelling. It was after his reign that the era of the Republic began in Rome. But more on that later. So, the royal period of Rome became the foundation for the city's further development. Even though the kings were different, each of them left their mark. creating the foundations on which the great republic and later the empire would grow. But let's pause at this important point. We can see how Rome, though not yet the powerful state it would become, was laying the foundations for future greatness. During this period, the key elements were formed that would allow Rome to survive and later thrive: the army, laws, social structure, and religious practices. However, the royal period was just the beginning of the great journey. As Rome grew stronger with age and power, the moment inevitably arrived when the system based on kingship no longer met the needs of the city. Internal relations, the city's problems, and external threats called for a new approach. Soon, under the pressure of the people and reality itself, the monarchy was overthrown, and a new phase in Rome's development began: the start of the Republic. Now we reach this turning point. After the expulsion of the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Priscus, the city entered the era of the Republic. Everything created during the royal period became the foundation for Rome's state structure. But now, this structure had to become more flexible and democratic to handle the new challenges of the time. The city entered the era of the Republic. The Republic gave Rome a new form of government, but just like with the kings, its foundation still relied on principles developed during this very early period. The reign of the kings in Rome is not just the story of individual rulers and their conquests, but a unique period when the foundations were laid for everything that would later make Rome one of the greatest civilizations in the world. Life in Rome under the kings was full of contradictions. On one hand, it was still a young and unsettled city, but on the other hand, it was during this time that the most important institutions, traditions, and social structures were established, which would shape Rome's future. It's important to note that Rome during the reign of the kings was not at all like we usually imagine it: a grand and majestic city with magnificent forums and temples. It was a small, still modest town, surrounded by wild forests and developing on high hills, where the locals, mostly shepherds and farmers, focused on agriculture. Life here was tough and full of challenges, as it was a time of constant wars, battles with neighboring tribes, and invasions. However, it was precisely because of these hardships that Rome grew and became stronger. Under the first kings, for example, under Romulus, the life of Romans revolved around the basic needs of survival and defense. The city was surrounded by strong walls, as there was a real threat of attacks from neighboring tribes beyond its borders. The army, created by Romulus, was the most important institution. The idea of Rome as a military and defensive city emerged from the very beginning of its existence. The key tasks for the early Romans were protecting their territory, creating stability, and building relationships with neighboring tribes. The social structure of Rome during the kingdom period was not as strict and organized as it would later become during the Republic and Empire, but the foundational elements were already in place. One of the most important institutions was the plebeian class. Plebeians were people who did not belong to the patrician families, but became an important part of society through their labor and military achievements. This created a unique dynamic where not only knowledge of one's ancestry mattered, but also personal bravery, success in military campaigns, and devotion to the city. It is also important to mention the role of priests and religion in the lives of the Romans. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, is considered the founder of the Roman religious system. He introduced many rituals and ceremonies that became a part of daily life for the Romans. Religion was not just a set of traditions. It was the foundation for political order. Every Roman king was both a political and a religious leader. which strengthened his power. The social structure of Rome during the kingdom period was not as strict and organized as it would later become during the Republic and Empire, but the foundational elements were already in place. One of the most important institutions was the plebeian class. Plebeians were people who did not belong to the patrician families, but became an important part of society through their labor and military achievements. This created a unique dynamic where not only knowledge of one's ancestry mattered, but also personal bravery, success in military campaigns, and devotion to the city. It is also important to mention the role of priests and religion in the lives of the Romans. Numa Pompilius, the second king of Rome, is considered the founder of the Roman religious system. He introduced many rituals and ceremonies that became a part of daily life for the Romans. Religion was not just a set of traditions. It was the foundation for political order. Every Roman king was both a political and a religious leader, which strengthened his power. The period of kingship was not just a temporary phase in Rome's history. It was the foundation upon which the entire future of the city was built. It was during this period that the foundations were laid, which would later make Rome great. It is important to understand that each king contributed to the strengthening and expansion of the city, whether through military campaigns, strengthening the social structure, or creating the first legal framework. At this point, Rome was not yet a powerful empire, but it had already become an important center, gathering new allies around it, with its culture and traditions starting to spread. Even though the reign of the kings ended with the exile of the last king, Tarquin, this period marked the starting point for the creation of the Roman Republic. It was under the kings that Rome became the powerful force that would later raise the banner of the Republic and then the Empire. The kingdom period of Rome holds great significance because it was a time when Rome had yet to reach the heights it would later attain. But the foundations of its strength and uniqueness were already being laid. Roman laws, the army, religion, even architecture, all of these began to develop during the kingdom period. It was a time when the small city on the hills began to realize that it could not only survive, but also thrive. This period became the time for forming what would later be called the Roman identity. Even though Rome itself was not yet an empire, and its influence was not yet felt far beyond its borders, it was at this moment that its story began as a city that would one day rule the world. Let's pause here at this important point. We see how Rome, even though it was not yet the powerful state it would become, was laying the groundwork for its future greatness. In this period, the key elements that would allow Rome to survive and later prosper were first formed: the army, laws, social structure, and religious practices. However, the kingdom period was only the beginning of a great journey. And as Rome grew stronger and its power expanded, the time inevitably came when the system based on kingship no longer met the needs of the city. The expulsion of the kings from Rome was a turning point in the city's history, marking the beginning of a new phase in its development, the creation of the Roman Republic. It was not just the overthrow of a dynasty, but a whole process reflecting changes in Rome's political and social life, as well as growing dissatisfaction with the rule of the kings. To understand how this happened, let's take a closer look at the causes, circumstances, and consequences of the expulsion of the last Roman kings. The system of monarchy in Rome had existed since the city's founding, and over the years, monarchs played a crucial role in strengthening and expanding Rome. However, by the time of the reign of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, or Tarquinius Priscus, the situation in Rome began to change. Despite successful conquests and the strengthening of the city, the reigns of the last kings were marked by cruel tyranny, political repression, and corruption. Tarquinius Superbus was a ruler known for his cruelty and ambitions. He sought to expand his power by tightening control over the people and threatening the aristocracy. He also used military campaigns and forced labor to build grand structures, which earned him popularity among some social groups, but simultaneously bred hatred in others. Another significant reason for his overthrow was the tragic story of his daughter Tarpeia and the violent act she was involved in. According to the famous story, the son of Tarquinius Superbus, Sextus, raped a woman named Lucretia, the wife of a Roman aristocrat. Lucretia, humiliated and dishonored, took her own life, and her death became the catalyst for a popular uprising. The death of Lucretia became a symbol of oppression, and her husband, sons, and relatives, including Lucius Junius Brutus, decided to overthrow the monarchy and expel the kings. It was Lucius Junius Brutus, the nephew of Tarquinius Superbus, who became the main driving force behind this uprising. In 509 BCE, an uprising was organized in Rome. The people and aristocrats united against Tarquinius, and soon the royal power was overthrown. Brutus, who played a key role in organizing the resistance, became one of the first consuls of the new republic, and Tarquinius Superbus was expelled from the city. Historians claim that Tarquinius attempted to reclaim the throne with the help of an army, but he failed and was forced to flee to neighboring Etruria. The beginning of the Roman Republic marked a key moment in the city's history, laying the foundation for the political system that would shape Rome for centuries to come. The overthrow of the kings in 509 BCE marked the start of a new chapter in Rome's history. Rome had finally rid itself of monarchy, but this did not mean that its political system was immediately stable. On the contrary, the new republican system was complex and full of contradictions. When the last king of Rome, Tarquinius Superbus, was expelled, the Romans realized that they could not return to the old order. The people were tired of the despotic rule of the kings, particularly the cruelty and tyranny of Tarquinius. This dissatisfaction became the catalyst for change. The key figures in the overthrow of the monarchy were Lucius Junius Brutus and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus. They led the uprising that resulted in the expulsion of the king. However, the destruction of the monarchy did not mean complete freedom for the people. Instead of returning to old customs, the Romans decided to create a new, fairer system, one that, in addition to excluding a single ruler, included a balance of powers and a division of authority. In the early years of the Republic, Rome was governed by 2 consuls, who were elected for 1 year. This was an important step in ensuring a balance of power and preventing the establishment of a new dictatorship. Each consul could veto the actions of the other, creating a system of checks and balances. Consuls were the chief magistrates, leading the army and administering justice, but their power was limited by their short term of office, which prevented abuse. This collegial power was an important achievement. Unlike the autocracy of a monarch, the consuls worked together, and their actions had to be checked and balanced. This limited the possibility for one person to gain absolute power, as was the case under the kings. The Senate also became an important part of the new Roman political system. It was mainly composed of patricians, representatives of the ancient Roman families who held power in the early republic. Senators advised the consuls and played an important role in making political decisions, such as military campaigns or establishing peace treaties. The Senate became a kind of arbiter in state affairs, but in the early stages of the Republic, its power was not absolute. However, for the plebeians, who were not part of the Roman aristocracy, access to Senate positions was closed. It is important to note that in the early years of the Republic, there was a deep social divide between the patricians and the plebeians. The plebeians made up the majority of Rome's population, but they had no political rights, could not hold high offices, and were forced to obey the aristocracy. This created tension, which led to a series of social conflicts known as the class struggles. In response to these issues, the plebeians began demanding reforms. One of the most important reforms introduced in the early decades of the Republic was the institution of the tribunes of the people. The tribunes were elected by the plebeians themselves and were given the right to veto the decisions of the consuls and the Senate if they harmed the interests of ordinary citizens. This was an important step toward equality and social justice. The plebeians got what they wanted, and gradually the system of government became more inclusive. In the early years of the Republic, Rome actively developed its army, which became one of the key factors in the success of the new regime. The Roman army was organized not only for the defense of the city, but also for conquests. The Romans used their army to expand their territory and establish control over neighboring peoples, which allowed Rome to become the dominant power in Latium and beyond. The new republican system also helped create a powerful military machine, as the army became not only a professional force but also required all citizens to defend their homeland when necessary. In this sense, the army and the republic were inseparable. The beginning of the Roman Republic laid the foundation for the creation of a political system that lasted in various forms for over 400 years. Despite all the contradictions and social problems, the Republic established the most important principles: the election of magistrates, the separation of powers, collegiality, and the principle of res publica, the common good. These ideas later became the foundation for a political system that significantly influenced the development of other states and was the key to Rome's prosperity. This combination of structures and values played a huge role in the creation and prosperity of the Roman Republic. Despite all the social unrest and political contradictions, it was the republican form of government that became the foundation, allowing Rome to achieve such incredible scale and power. The First Greek War, also known as the War with Veii, was an important stage in the early history of the Roman Republic. It took place between 480 to 474 BC and was part of a larger conflict that determined Rome's future as a great military power in the territory of Italy. Veii, an ancient Etruscan city, was one of Rome's strongest neighbors and a threat to its territorial expansion. This war was crucial for Rome, which sought not only to protect its borders but also to expand its influence. Veii, a powerful opponent. Veii was one of the largest and most powerful cities in Etruria, located just a few dozen kilometers from Rome. Veii, like Rome, was an important military and cultural center with a developed army and a strong economy based on agriculture and crafts. At this time, Etruria was divided into several city-states which often fought each other, yet Veii remained one of the region's leaders. From the very beginning, the Romans realized that Veii would be a significant obstacle to their growth. Veii had not only a strong army but also rich resources, making them a powerful opponent for Rome, which was just beginning its expansion. As expected, the first clashes between the two cities occurred during the monarchy, but serious military confrontation began in the Republic era. One of the main reasons for the war with Veii was Rome's desire for territorial expansion. Rome, still a young republic, needed new territories to increase its population, resources, and opportunities for development. Veii, being a prosperous city with its strategically important location and trade routes, posed a major obstacle to Roman expansion. Moreover, there is an opinion that the war was caused by personal and political motives related to the struggle for resources and influence between neighboring peoples. Veii also sought to strengthen its dominance in the region and exert pressure on Rome. As a result, conflicts between the two cities became inevitable. The war with Veii lasted almost 10 years, during which both sides carried out active military actions multiple times. The Romans could not completely defeat Veii in open battle, and Veii, in turn, could not achieve a decisive victory over Rome. However, one of the most decisive stages of the war came in 476 BC, when the Romans, led by Consul Furius Camillus, began the siege of Veii. The war entered its decisive phase when the Romans decided to use siege tactics, which allowed them to win. One of the most prominent heroes of the First Greek War was Furius Camillus, a Roman general who played a key role in the destruction of Veii. Camillus was an experienced military commander and displayed outstanding strategy in organizing the siege. He showed bravery and determination, which allowed Rome to gain a significant advantage. During the siege of Veii, Camillus used a unique tactic. The Romans dug an underground tunnel beneath the city walls, through which they managed to break inside. In 474 BC, Veii was captured and destroyed, and the city's inhabitants were either killed or taken prisoner. After the fall of Veii, Rome gained immense wealth and territorial resources. Victory in this war strengthened Rome's authority in Latium and beyond. Additionally, the victory over Veii symbolized the beginning of Roman expansion into Etruria, which was an important step on the path to the future empire. Rome's victory in the First Greek War was of great importance. First of all, it destroyed one of the strongest and most dangerous cities in Italy. Secondly, Rome gained important territories that greatly strengthened its economy and strategic position. Additionally, the victory in the war with Veii made Rome the dominant power in Latium and allowed it to focus on further conquests in Italy. However, despite the importance of the victory, the war with Veii also showed the Romans how difficult and costly the process of conquest could be. This made Rome think about a more far-sighted policy toward other neighbors and lay the foundations for future expansion. After the victory in the war with Veii, Rome continued to develop actively, expanding its influence in other parts of Italy. The Romans strengthened their positions in the region, continuing to wage wars with neighbors, but now with an advantage in resources and territory. Camillus, as a hero, became popular not only in Rome, but also in other parts of Italy. The victory in the war with Veii also strengthened the republican form of government in Rome, which became an important signal for future generations of Romans. From this time on, Rome continued its path to greatness, including through military conquests, but also becoming more confident in its strength and political power. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 BC, was the most important conflict between Rome and Carthage, two great powers of the time. It was a war for dominance in the Western Mediterranean, which ultimately brought Rome the status of a great maritime power and foreshadowed its further expansion. The Punic Wars, which would continue intermittently until 146 BC, played a decisive role in Rome's history, and the First Punic War became the first of 3 battles between these two powers, where Rome would face major challenges and change the balance of power in the Mediterranean. Carthage was the largest naval and trading power in the Western Mediterranean and held a crucial strategic position in North Africa. with colonies all along the coast, including Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and other islands. This made Carthage a major rival to Rome, which, at the time, was actively expanding its holdings on the Italian peninsula. The conflict between Rome and Carthage began in Sicily, which was at the time controlled by various peoples. This island held strategic importance as it lay on trade routes and was a key point for controlling the Mediterranean Sea. In 264 BC, a conflict broke out on Sicily between two Carthaginian colonies, Syracuse and the Mamertines, mercenaries who had seized the city of Messana in the north of the island. The Mamertines, concerned about the possibility of increased Carthaginian strength in the region, appealed to Rome for help. Rome, interested in expanding its influence on Sicily, accepted their proposal and sent an army to the island. Carthage, also interested in maintaining control over Sicily, saw Rome's intervention as a threat to its dominance in the region and began preparing for war. Thus, the conflict between Rome and Carthage, which initially started in Sicily, turned into a full-scale war. First phase of the war: land clashes. In the early stages of the war, Rome was confident in its strength, as its army was one of the best in the world, especially on land. Carthage, on the other hand, had a naval advantage and used its fleet to transport and supply its troops in Sicily. The Carthaginians were strong at sea and had experience in naval battles, while Rome was generally unprepared for naval warfare. However, despite Carthage's successes at sea, the Romans were able to achieve important victories on land. The Roman legions, thanks to their military skill and discipline, defeated the Carthaginians in several battles, allowing them to secure a foothold in Sicily. One such battle was the Battle of Heraclea, 260 BC, where the Romans, despite Carthage's naval advantage, won the land battle. Second phase of the war: Rome creates a fleet. To effectively fight against Carthage's naval power, Rome decided to create its own fleet. This was a challenging and ambitious decision, as Rome was essentially a land-based state and had no experience in naval battles. However, thanks to innovative efforts, the Romans built a fleet and established their naval power. Inspired by their land victories and the strengthening of their fleet, the Romans delivered a decisive blow to Carthage at sea. The Roman fleet, thanks to a new tactic using boarding bridges, special mechanical devices mounted on the bows of ships for capturing enemy vessels, significantly improved its chances in naval battles. In 260 BC, at the Battle of Mylae, the Romans achieved their first important naval victory, giving them a significant advantage in the war. Carthage could not resist Rome's military power for long, and despite attempts to hold its ground, the decisive naval battle at the Aegates Islands took place in 241 BC. In this battle, Rome won, destroying most of the Carthaginian fleet. Afterward, Carthage had no choice but to ask for peace. The outcome of the war. The First Punic War ended in 241 BC with a peace treaty in which Carthage was forced to give up Sicily and pay Rome a massive tribute of 3,200 talents, a huge amount at the time. Rome gained control of Sicily, marking its first possession outside Italy and paving the way for further expansion. The First Punic War was of immense importance to Rome. First, it secured Rome's dominance in the Western Mediterranean, including Sicily, which became a crucial strategic and economic base for Rome's further development. Secondly, Rome proved its ability to wage successful wars not only on land but also at sea, significantly strengthening its military power and reputation. Rome's victory in the First Punic War also marked the beginning of its rise as a naval power. This laid the foundation for Rome's future victories in the Punic Wars and its eventual control over the entire Mediterranean. For Carthage, the defeat was a huge blow, though they soon tried to rebuild their strength, leading to the Second Punic War with Rome. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 BC, was one of the most famous and dramatic conflicts in the history of Rome and Carthage. This was a war that shaped Rome's future as a great world power and strengthened its military might, but also required immense effort and brought significant losses for the Romans. The war is especially famous due to the outstanding Carthaginian general Hannibal, whose actions and tactics became legendary. Although Carthage ultimately lost, the Second Punic War was a crucial milestone on Rome's path to future dominance. After the First Punic War, Carthage, despite losing Sicily and suffering significant economic losses, remained a powerful state, especially in Africa and Spain. However, the defeat in the First War and the harsh terms of the peace treaty left Carthage with a desire to avenge Rome and regain lost ground. In 221 BC, a new strategist, Hannibal Barca, came to power in Carthage, a young general whose personal hatred for Rome and his ambitions became the driving forces of the war. Hannibal, having strengthened Carthage's position in Spain, devised a plan to attack Rome. This happened after he gained control over key lands in Spain and began to strengthen an army ready for a brutal conflict. In 218 BC, Hannibal set his ambitious plan into motion, which became famous for its audacity and military genius. He led his army across the Pyrenees and the Alps, literally crossing the entire continent to attack Rome from the north. This was an incredibly risky decision since the Alps were difficult to traverse, and most of the army expected the attack to come from the south through Sicily or other sea routes. However, Hannibal surprised the Romans with his bold and unconventional approach. During the journey through the Alps, Hannibal lost a significant portion of his troops, including elephants, which became a symbol of his campaign. However, the mere fact that he managed to cross such difficult terrain and reach Italy had a profound psychological impact. Battle of Lake Trasimene, 217 BC. For the Romans, this was a shock, and they couldn't immediately figure out how to respond to the threat coming from their northern borders. Hannibal was an outstanding general, and his military tactics have been studied for centuries. His ability to maneuver his troops and put his enemies in difficult situations earned him several notable victories during the war. One of the most dramatic and tragic moments for Rome was the Battle of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal, successfully using the tactics of ambush and maneuver, completely surrounded the Roman army. In this battle, the Romans lost around 15,000 soldiers, with just as many captured. This was one of the largest defeats for the Roman army. Battle of Cannae, 216 BC. Hannibal's most famous victory came at the Battle of Cannae. This battle became the greatest tactical victory in history. Hannibal used the tactic of double encirclement, trapping the Romans and denying them any possibility of retreat. In the end, the Romans lost about 70,000 soldiers, which was a catastrophic blow for Rome. The Roman army was almost destroyed, and many believed that the war for Rome was lost. Rome's response and the strategy of Fabius Maximus. After a series of catastrophic defeats, the Romans realized that they could not defeat Hannibal in direct confrontations. The Roman elite, including the consul Fabius Maximus, concluded that they needed to change their tactics. Maximus proposed a strategy known as the strategy of survival, or the Fabian strategy. The strategy involved avoiding large battles with Hannibal and instead wearing down his army through small skirmishes, blockades, and disrupting his supply lines. This was a long-term approach that allowed Rome to survive and rebuild its strength. Despite all his successes, Hannibal was unable to secure a decisive victory. One of the key problems was his inability to establish a reliable supply line and support from Carthage. His army was gradually wearing down, and despite numerous victories, Hannibal could not approach Rome because his forces were exhausted and lacked sufficient resources. Furthermore, Carthage did not provide him with adequate reinforcements, which became a significant factor in his failure. The Carthaginian Senate was divided and could not provide Hannibal with the necessary support. His army was too far from Carthage, while Rome was strengthening itself despite the defeats. Rome gradually recovered, and in 204 BC, in response to Carthage's weakening, began its successful military campaigns. The Roman general Publius Cornelius Scipio struck Africa, where he won an important victory at the Battle of Zama in 202 BC. This was the decisive battle of the war, in which Hannibal was defeated. Scipio used excellent maneuvers and superior organization of his troops, which allowed him to defeat Hannibal and his forces. After the defeat at Zama, Carthage was forced to sign a peace treaty in 201 BC. The terms of the peace were very harsh for Carthage. They had to pay a massive indemnity, limit their military forces, cede significant territories, including Spain, to Rome, and renounce their struggle for maritime hegemony. The Second Punic War was a great victory for Rome, which, despite heavy losses, managed to maintain its power and become the dominant force in the Western Mediterranean. Hannibal remained in Carthage, but could no longer restore his country's strength. Rome, on the other hand, became the unquestionable leader in the region, and the victory in this war determined its further expansion and the establishment of control over almost the entire Mediterranean. Thank you very much for watching this video. In the next episode, we will talk about the Third Punic War and its causes. We will analyze the fall of Carthage, what problems arose in Rome, how exactly the Roman Republic rose to its power, and we will smoothly lead to the main crisis of the Republic and the beginning of the history of Julius Caesar and his struggle for power. Subscribe to the channel, write comments, and see you in the depths of history.